Hello and welcome, and thank you for tuning in for this conversation with Dr. Bruce Hoffman, Professor of Security Studies at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and Editor-in-Chief of the journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. Good morning, Bruce.
Hey, James.
I'd like to talk to you for the next 40 minutes or so about a variety of topics of interest to students and researchers in the study of terrorism and counterterrorism. Let's begin with your earliest recollection that studying terrorism was something that you wanted to do. When you were an undergraduate student in government history at Connecticut College, were there any professors, lectures, or courses on terrorism or political violence that inspired you to pursue this field of study?
No, it was all self-generated, but it does date back to my undergraduate time. That was an era. I arrived as an undergraduate as a freshman in 1972, Connecticut College, and that was an era when the academic year commenced after Labor Day, not before, as is the fashion today. So consequently, in the early days of, well, I should say in the middle of September, basically, or the early days of September, um, the Munich Olympic attack happened. And while everyone was off doing the freshman orientation stuff, I was glued to literally this black and white TV in a wood box with rabbit ear antennas. I mean, one can't imagine that now, with lots of snow because the reception was not great. But watching the drama of the Munich Olympic attacks unfold, and that stuck in my mind. And when I went to graduate school 4 years later, the fall of 1976, the graduate program I was in at Oxford University, it oddly enough required you to identify your thesis topic, which wouldn't be due for another 16 months or so, wouldn't be due until spring. Um, a year and a half hence, a year plus when you finished was a 2-year degree program. You had to identify your thesis topic and find a supervisor your first semester. And in December 1976, the French arrested Abu Daoud, who was one of the architects of the Munich Olympic massacre. And despite extradition treaties with what was then West Germany and Israel, they refused to extradite him and they actually released him. And that had a big impact on me. I thought, what is it about terrorism that compels established nation states to accede to the demands of these non-state actors, even to the extent that they will violate international legal treaties, will violate understandings of international law. And that's what focused me on terrorism. And I had a very indulgent supervisor who I was thinking of doing something on the legal aspect, and he had no interest in that, as it often happens in life. You have to depend on the kindness and the perspicacity of mentors. And he said, well, why don't you do your thesis comparing the Zionist terrorist groups of the 1940s, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, to the Palestinian terrorist groups of the 1960s and 1970s, so the contemporaneous groups. And as a child, I had seen the film Exodus, so I was aware of the Irgun and the Stern Gang, because both of them feature in the film, the bombing of the King David Hotel. And that's what basically solidified my interest in terrorism. I did that thesis, which was equivalent of a master's thesis, and submitted it in March or April 1978. And then that was a sea change was happening. Firstly, some months after I fastened on this topic in the spring of 1977, Menachem Begin, who was the commander of the Irgun and the architect of the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel, which was also the British military headquarters and intelligence headquarters, and where the government secretariat was, so it wasn't just a hotel. But he was elected prime minister, and this was a sea change in Israeli politics. It was the first time in 30 years that the Israeli Labor Party, which is moribund now, but was out of office. So this was huge, but this happened after I'd already selected the topic. But simultaneous to that, the British archives have a 30-year rule. And 30 years after 1947, 1948, all the documents would be, not all, many were held back. But most of the documents, many of the documents were being released by what was then the Public Record Office and is now the National Archives in Britain. And I thought this afforded a scholar, myself, the opportunity to learn firsthand and examine the documents and understand how terrorism affects a government decision making and policy making, um, especially in the context of the British decision to surrender the mandate for Palestine, which they had been awarded by the League of Nations in 1922, and to just leave. So that was the reason I did a PhD. I was not planning to do a PhD. I had no interest really in an academic career at that time, but it was the opportunity to research in the archives and be amongst the first people to see these documents and to get this understanding, going back to how, the Abu Daoud story, how terrorism affects government calculations. That's what, in essence, you know, led me on the path to terrorism studies. And then let me just add one thing. I was very fortunate too, because at the time when I was researching my master's thesis, the two persons work who influenced me the most were Paul Wilkinson, who I wouldn't meet for years later, especially Terror in the Liberal State, which was published in 1977, and Brian Jenkins. And I thought Brian's work was the clearest, the least laden with theory and jargon, that it was actually empirically unpacking exactly what was unfolding, analyzing it, and coming up with policy responses to terrorism. So I wrote to Brian and asked him some questions for my master's thesis. And he wrote back and said, oh, by the way, if you do decide to pursue the PhD, I had to finish the master's, then get accepted into the PhD program. He said, we have a summer internship. It's now a summer associate program. Why don't you apply for it when the time is right? And so that was 1970, the end of 1977, the beginning of 1978. And 3 years later, I came to RAND as a summer intern, returned the next summer, and then joined RAND full time in 1983 and worked for Brian for nearly a decade.
That's fantastic. I was actually going to ask you how you wound up at the Rand Corporation. Did the professors at Oxford University, I guess, encouraged you to pursue the PhD then in this field, and you went on to finish that? And
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, James. It's exactly because all of this depends really. As academicians, we understand how important we are to students. I'm not sure students necessarily, in retrospect, they certainly appreciate it, but at the time, I was unbelievably lucky that even though there was maybe one other person, another student interested in terrorism at Oxford at that time in the entire university, I had three really incredibly supportive supervisors. The first one was Wilfred Knapp, who was a North African specialist, and therefore, and especially on Algeria, so had a particular interest. But I was really enormously fortunate that two of the biggest names in the field at the time were interested in terrorism and learning about terrorism, and therefore were willing to take a chance on me. One of them was Professor Hedley Bull, who wrote The Anarchical Society and was an enormously influential figure in theories of international relations. That was probably the hardest course I ever took in my life. And he was very supportive and interested. But although he stepped in and supervised and actually saved my master's thesis, so I'll always be indebted to him for that. He made some last minute corrections that really saved me, because I was a very callow undergraduate student. I was really kind of clueless. But then I was really fortunate that the world's leading military historian and strategist, Professor Sir Michael Howard, agreed to supervise my PhD. And he himself, as it turned out, he didn't serve in Palestine. He served in World War II in Italy, where he was seriously injured. But I didn't know this until we were talking. And he said, well, technically I'm Jewish. And I looked at him because he's like a paragon of the established Englishman. He'd gone to Christ Church, for example, which doesn't, this was, figured very prominently in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. You don't get more establishment than that. But his mother and her family had emigrated from Germany and was German Jewish. And even though he wasn't Jewish himself, he said when he was an officer in the Coldstream Guards during World War II and after World War II, he said people didn't realize that he was half Jewish and not a practicing Jew. He said, I firsthand experienced and witnessed the anti-Semitism that played a huge role in British policy in Palestine. So he was also personally very interested in the subject. So I was enormously lucky that I had these supportive mentors and teachers.
It's a good lesson for all of us, to pay attention to the interests of our doctoral students and encourage them, nurture them, even if they're kind of a little bit out of our field. Um, at Rand Corporation, I was going to ask you, you held a number of positions at Rand. You were research staff to the corporate chair in counterterrorism and in counterinsurgency, director of Rand's Washington, D.C. office, vice president for external affairs. All these positions, but at the same time, you also held senior fellow positions at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, Council on Foreign Relations, and several other organizations over the years. Could you share with us just a few of your favorite or even maybe least favorite experiences working with these organizations in all these different capacities?
Well, I'm often very proud of the fact that I had every job possible at Rand except for president, because I was a summer intern to a vice president. Rand had still has very few vice presidents. So that was a big deal. Um, Rand was a great place to work. I left it twice for academe because I guess my heart was always in academe and in scholarship. You could do that at Rand. I don't think I ever worked on anything I wasn't interested in or motivated, but it was still client-driven projects. And as I said, the first time I left Rand in 1994 when I moved to St. Andrews, and then had the good fortune to work with Professor Paul Wilkinson, another giant in the field. I was, been so lucky throughout my career. Um, as I said at my goodbye party, and I would say that would characterize my experiences even today, because I'm, closer to retirement than I am to anything else in my career. But at Rand, and since then, I've never woken up one morning and never wanted to go to work, which is a real blessing in one's life. Rand was an enormously supportive place. It was infinitely fascinating. One got to do extensive field work, which in this field of studies terrorism was then a remarkable development. I've written in the past that a lot of the academics who wrote about terrorism in the 60s and 70s, even the 80s, did so from university libraries or from the faculty lounges, or perhaps if they were historians from the archives. But a lot of them did not have any firsthand experience. And because of Rand, I got to do an extraordinary amount of field work, which including interviewing terrorists, starting in the late 1980s, which enormously influenced my work. Because I had been the co-founder with Paul Wilkinson and the first director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at St. Andrews University, which fantastically is still going strong, still exists. Then Colonel Russ Howard and Captain Reed Sawyer, who were in the social sciences department at West Point right after 9/11, asked me if I would lend my assistance and expertise to help them to establish the Combating Terrorism Center. And I began to spend a lot of time at West Point. And as you know, we were colleagues for several years. Was a senior fellow and come up at least once a semester for several days and give lectures. And that was, an absolutely pivotal experience, because it was unlike teaching at universities, because all those people, especially in the 2000s, were all going to either Afghanistan and Iraq. And I meet so many people who were students in social sciences back then, today, who are now, colonels, probably, hopefully, will get to flag rank. But their progression over 20 years has led them to senior military rank, and who remember the CTC, the Combating Terrorism Center, remember the courses they take, even remember the lectures that I gave. I mean, this has happened so many times in recent years, so that was enormously formative as well. And then it's been great to have the opportunity, not quite to divide my time because I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, but 8 years ago, it was great to have the opportunity to return to a think tank and to work at a think tank. I was there during a sabbatical full time, and then transitioned to my status now. And serious research is often done at the think tanks. I don't think they get enough credit, because that's basically the coin of the realm there. If you're not researching, writing, and publishing in one form or another, you just don't stay there. And also, there's tremendous resources that think tanks have. You don't have to chase grants necessarily. sometimes think tanks have endowments, or you can use grants through their processes. But it's that connectivity with the policy world is more easily facilitated, I would argue, through think tanks than through universities.
I want to follow up on the field research for a moment. You conducted field research on terrorism insurgency in well over a dozen countries throughout the Middle East, Central and Southeast Asia, and Latin America. What were some of your favorite or maybe least favorite experiences conducting that field research, and what advice would you give to current or future researchers about doing this kind of research?
Firstly, I think it was easier to do it when I was doing it than it is today, because I mean, terrorism was in a different era before 9/11, and the terrorists were desperate for ciphers. They wanted to talk about their experiences. I mean, I interviewed lots of terrorists, prisons, in their encampments. I mean, that was an era when they weren't reflexively hostile to Westerners, for example, to people who may not have been of their religion, because they wanted to get their message across. They didn't have access to social media or even the internet in that era. So anyone that was paying attention to them, they were very keen. I mean, you had to be careful, of course, not to be just to be a messenger for them. But there was an access that I think is much more difficult today. And I would say it was appreciably dangerous, and I was probably very foolish back then in some of the things that I did. Unfortunately, nothing ever really happened, but I think it's far more dangerous today. I mean, there was a doctoral student just recently, two that I can think of off the top of my head. One, a student at Princeton who was doing research in Iran and was imprisoned. And then, of course, there was an Israeli American scholar, a woman, who, when she was doing field work in Iraq a couple of years ago, was kidnapped by one of the Shia militias. So it's a lot more dangerous. But for me, it was absolutely pivotal to my knowledge of terrorism. And the first edition of Inside Terrorism, which was published in 1998, talks about this more. But I often didn't take notes because they could be used by the authorities, and also people might not have spoken as freely. So these weren't, back then you didn't have, institutional review boards that you had to go through, for example. So this was all to enhance my general knowledge, not really because I wanted to dig deep into one particular issue. So most of the time I didn't take notes. So there are some notes that I have, but I just wanted to understand basically why they chose this path of violence, where radical people or other people at the time, chose a much more normal path in life, or much more nonviolent means of political change. So I think, as you pointed out, I think it's like 30 countries actually, but Sri Lanka was enormously influential. That was probably, it's certainly in the 90s, the most dangerous place I went. I went to Gaza multiple times, the West Bank, obviously. I spent in the 1990s multiple trips annually to Northern Ireland, where I interviewed what they call paramilitaries on both sides. Interviewed people again, both sides in Turkey. I mean, Turkey in the 1980s had far left and far right problems. It was fascinating to speak to people from those two perspectives. Armenian militants and terrorists. I mean, it's just a long list. Basque separatists, Palestinians, obviously, historically Israelis who were involved in terrorism in the 1940s, and built up, what I hoped was an understanding of the phenomena from the actual people who carried out terrorism, and also who were engaged in counterterrorism. I also had extensive work, or interviewed, I should say, government counterterrorists from at all different levels and dimensions.
And is all driven by the fact that it's a phenomenon of human behavior that's a chosen behavior. They why do they choose this kind of behavior? It's a driving question that we pursue all the time in this field of terrorism studies. You mentioned Inside Terrorism, and I also wanted to congratulate you on the fact that this third edition is becoming a fourth edition. It's remarkable. Congratulations on that. I know my students are very much looking forward to seeing that, as am I. You've also been the editor-in-chief of the premier journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism and editor of the Columbia University Press series on terrorism and irregular warfare. From your vantage point, writing the textbook, editing the journal, and the book series, what have been some of the most significant developments in the field of terrorism studies overall?
I think certainly with the 9/11 attacks, terrorism crossed the threshold from having been a law enforcement problem or something that was addressed more in the courts to becoming a strategic and therefore military and intelligence problem. So I think that was one important watershed. And then in rapid succession, which makes the study of terrorism both so fascinating but also so compelling, you had more changes unfolding in a shorter period of time. The advent of suicide terrorism, which was a very isolated phenomenon in the 1980s and the 1990s, but became pervasive, became almost global, really, in the 2000s, and remains so today, and spread to parts of the world where it hadn't existed before. Certainly, the advent of the internet and then of social media has transformed terrorism and their ability to radicalize and recruit. And of course, ISIS is an exemplar of that, being the first truly transnational terrorist organization, having recruited foreign fighters from more than 80 countries, on the order of more than 50,000 foreign fighters. I mean, this was without precedent, all facilitated really by social media. And that excludes the lone wolves and lone actors who they inspired, motivated, and ultimately animated to carry out attacks completely independently, but in the service to ISIS's ideology. And then today, I think we underestimate the transformative power that the October 7th, 2023 terrorist attacks on Israel had. I mean, the war with Iran now is a direct product of that. The upheaval that we've seen throughout the Middle East since then is a direct product of that. I think a lot of the tactics that we saw that day are going to have a very strong impression on terrorism going forward. Firstly, swarming attacks. Certainly simultaneous coordinated suicide attacks, fortunately, have not occurred as regularly as we feared in the aftermath of 9/11. But when we think of simultaneous attacks on the Madrid commuter rail network, which were not suicide attacks in 2004, the suicide attacks on London transport in 2005. I mean, these are sort of the hallmark terrorist incidents, along with 9/11, we think of, but perhaps the most consequential have been swarming attacks that involve simultaneously highly mobile and highly fluid attacks that are designed to completely overwhelm a country's defenses. And we saw that in Mumbai with the Lashkar-e-Taiba attacks in November 2008. We saw that in Paris, France, with the attacks in November 2015 by ISIS. And then once again, swarming attacks were so pivotal to Hamas's operations, and then the use of drones, unmanned aerial systems, which we see are playing such a huge role in either the war in Ukraine, but even in the conflicts in the Middle East since then. We see terrorism being transformed dramatically by inexpensive, basically off-the-shelf, commercially available armaments. And then finally, a long-standing debate in terrorism going back to the 1970s about would terrorists use a weapon of mass destruction of some kind. Fortunately, that hasn't happened, but it's not for, I would argue, lack of effort or interest on the terrorists' part, but I fear artificial intelligence and machine learning tools may facilitate that. But the point I'm getting at is we never thought of terrorism up until 9/11 as at all existential. So in that sense, it was a tragic nuisance most of the time, but 9/11, went beyond that. Obviously, it has, as I said, it had strategic implications. But even 9/11, there was nothing existential about it. Arguably, if bin Laden could have had a nuclear weapon, we know he was trying to get one, he might have used it. But that's what stands out about October 7th is that that was conceived as an existential attack. I mean, what Yahya Sinwar and Hamas hoped to do was provoke Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran to join in these attacks on Israel. And also, we know that the Hamas terrorists that crossed the border, I mean, it wasn't, their plan was not just to stage cross-border attacks. They actually wanted to bisect Israel. They wanted to make it to the West Bank, which would be enormously significant from their point of view. So I worry now that part of the trend that we're seeing is that terrorism in the future, what was something we feared and worried about, but was not at all within reach or practical, the existential dimension, could become more so in the future. And the fact that, Mali is now besieged by the JNIM and by jihadi terrorists. I mean, you can see that terrorism all of a sudden does have existential consequences for countries. I mean, the Taliban's reconquest of Afghanistan is a case in point as well.
And I guess it would be probably safe to say that terrorists, at least the terrorist groups that we're most concerned about, study other terrorists and learn from their successes and their failures along the way, and become more sophisticated and more capable of doing things that we may not anticipate yet.
No, exactly. I mean, this has been a preoccupation of mine throughout my career. Is that I've been saying for decades, terrorists learn well. They have to, or they don't survive, and they learn from the mistakes as well as the successes of their own operations, but also they study other terrorist groups. Unfortunately, governments, militaries, and intelligence community are driven by the threat du jour and often don't retain the institutional memory and constantly have to reinvent the wheel. Now, I was just across the highway in outside of Washington, D.C., just across from the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001, when American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into it. And, and then, the federal government closed down. Everybody had to go home. And then in Washington, when the federal government closes, everyone else follows suit. I mean, this is very typical in snowstorms. We also found out it happens in terrorist events. And when I got downstairs, we had to leave the office building. My first thought was that, World War III has begun because the streets were thronged and packed with people. There was gridlock everywhere. Everyone was trying to escape anywhere, near Washington, D.C. There had been an explosion, which rumor was that a car bomb had gone off at the State Department or the Capitol. It turned out to be the helicopter fuel bladder at the Pentagon exploding because of the fire an hour or two later after the plane crashed into it. And I remember looking around me, and the metro, you couldn't get down into the metro. The line was snaking down the sidewalk. And I thought, we'll never let this happen again. We'll never become complacent. We'll have learned our lesson, and we'll always maintain our vigilance against the threat of terrorism and never discount it. And of course, what's happening now, I would argue, is every president since President Bush in the war on terror has declared victory over Al Qaeda, and then laterally ISIS. We've seen a massive shift since the new defense policy in January 2018, away from terrorism to peer competitors and great power competition. Absolutely, I always worried during the war on terror that the pendulum had swung too much and that we were so preoccupied with terrorism that eventually there would be a backlash, and rather than resetting and finding a good balance, we go back to dismissing or denigrating the threat of terrorism. And I worry that's where we are today.
Speaking of preoccupation, there seems to be a long-standing focus on jihadist terrorism as opposed to other kinds of terrorism. And you're known as one of the nation's foremost experts now on far-right extremism and terrorism, particularly after the publication of your 2024 book with Jacob Weir, God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America. What are the most important things you feel everyone needs to know about this topic?
When you think back 25 years ago to the era of 9/11, Al-Qaeda was the only serious threat we really had to contend with. There was really no domestic terrorist threat. There had been one, and that's what the book charts from the 1980s onward. There was a revival of a particularly virulent strain of white supremacism that also embraced sedition and anti-government sentiments and culminated in the 1995 bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah federal office building in Oklahoma City, where 168 persons were killed. But then the FBI cracked down on that movement, and they basically disappeared. So in the early 2000s and around the time of 9/11, we could have the luxury of focusing on just one threat, which was the threat by Al-Qaeda. And we didn't have to contend with the threat of domestic terrorism. I mean, that has changed in the past decade. And now we also have the threat of radical left-wing terrorism as well. Uh, you know, that's I think the biggest challenge is we now have a waterfront of threats where we have to have a flexible and dynamic enough approach that we can shift and focus on all of them, but allocate resources where they're most important. But at the same time, terrorism has become extraordinarily politicized. It's become political fodder for both sides. And the unanimity, I mean, I often think back very longingly for for the kind of unanimity we had in Congress that was demonstrated on the evening of September 11th, 2001, where Democrats and Republicans joined arms on the steps of the Capitol and sang "God Bless America." And that message of unity was so important because it meant that united we could rise to any challenge. One can't even imagine that Democrats and Republicans could link arms and sing a song, much less enact bipartisan legislation. So we're in a much more parlous place, I think, than we've ever been with terrorism. We have multiple threats, domestic as well as international. There are many things I have to say in a career that's now lasted 50 years studying terrorism that I could never have imagined. But two of them are, one is that our closest allies, so the Five Eyes, or the five English-speaking countries with a common heritage, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that have had an unprecedented relationship in sharing intelligence since World War II, basically. I could have never conceived that, with the exception of the United States, all of the other Five Eyes would have US-based terrorist groups as designated foreign terrorist organizations in their countries. So this is an enormous problem. They're all far-right groups or far-right individuals. The other thing I could never have imagined, and this is not an assault in any sense or counteracting the First Amendment, the rights of people to protest as long as it's nonviolent, however they want. But in February 2025, in Washington Square Park in New York, there was a vigil that celebrated the quote-unquote martyr, Saeed Hassan Nasrallah. This was 1.4 miles from the 9/11 site, and there were Hezbollah flags and banners. Of course, Hassan Nasrallah is probably second only to Osama bin Laden as leading the terrorist group, Hezbollah, that has more American blood on its hands, only exceeded by Al-Qaeda. And yet there was a celebration of his life in Washington Square Park, so close to 9/11, which indicates we have very short memories, but also, I think, very worrisomely, that somehow terrorism is being legitimized or accepted to an extent that certainly was not the case over the past quarter century, but I would argue it really begun to change in the 1980s. When I first started studying terrorism, you'd often hear the saying, well, I don't agree with the terrorist tactics, but I understand or I sympathize with their motivations or understand their cause. But by the 1980s, when you had these massive suicide attacks against the U.S. embassies in Beirut in April 1983 and September 1984, the attack on the Marine barracks in October of 1983, the kidnappings of 36 Westerners, including U.S. citizens. State-sponsored terrorism was very common in the 1980s from Libya and Syria and Iraq. I mean, there was no agreement that terrorism was a good thing or was at all legitimate. And of course, that solidified after 9/11. But I worry we're sliding back into an era where terrorism is now accepted or justified, or that violence is is being approved even in democratic societies and liberal states where we change governments through elections, not through the gun or the bomb.
It strikes me with all these different complex dimensions of terrorism and, of course, counterterrorism as well. You must have struggled, like many of us as well, in terms of trying to teach about terrorism and counterterrorism to your students, undergraduate and graduate, over the many years you've taught courses in this field. Um, how has it changed over your career in terms of teaching about terrorism and counterterrorism? And what advice would you give to today's or maybe future generations of teachers who are designing their own courses to teach about terrorism, identifying what's most important to convey to these students and so forth?
Interestingly, inside terrorism would have never come about had I not been teaching about terrorism. It was my frustration with not having a single book that I could go to that would cover all the topics I wanted addressed, whether it was the historical trajectory of terrorism, terrorism in the media, government responses to terrorism, the terrorist mindset, and so on. I mean, that's what drove me to write Inside Terrorism. Um, and I mean, I've adjusted my teaching, but I think the key always is not to tell students what to think, but to teach them how to think. And, you know, for me, it's been very important to have an historical basis to the study of terrorism, to understand that not everything happening today is without precedent. There's enormous precedents, and you have to trace the historical trajectory and the lineage of this violence, and that's why it's changed. I think the most, at least my favorite, maybe the most memorable or my favorite sentence from Inside Terrorism has been describing terrorist groups like the archetypal shark in the water that have to constantly move forward to survive, but have to alter their course when they come up against barriers. Well, terrorists come up against governmental countermeasures, and for terrorists, survival is first and foremost their most important priority. So therefore, they have to adapt and adjust to overcome or obviate those government countermeasures. So it's important, I think, to have that historical trajectory, and then, to let students make up their own minds. I've written books on right-wing terrorism, as you pointed out, but if you look at left-wing terror, if you look at Inside Terrorism, there's a tremendous amount of material devoted to radical left-wing terrorism. I've written an award-winning book on Jewish terrorism in pre-state Israel, for example, but also have written extensively about the Palestinian movement as well. And I think you have to have that 360-degree perspective where you impart why terrorists do what they do. That's always the question. I think that's like from the first sentence of the first edition of Inside Terrorism almost 30 years ago. That's what the core of a course should be. Is there's no solution, there's no answer, but enabling students to understand that phenomena better, to draw their own analytical conclusions, but to give them the empirical material with which to reach those conclusions.
This is great advice. Obviously, for teaching, we're almost already at the near the end of our time together, but just a few more questions, if you don't mind. What do you think will be some of the most important research topics over the next 5 to 10 years in the study of terrorism and counterterrorism? Particularly any topics that graduate students or readers of our respective journals should consider pursuing, and corollary, what advice would you give to current PhD students or early career researchers who might want to submit their research to either the journal or the Columbia Book Series?
I've always found, this may be a very controversial thing to say, but I've always found the terrorism field to be very conservative, not with a capital C, with a small c, not politically conservative. Think Studies in Conflict and Terrorism was the only journal, not just the only terrorism journal, even the only journal in Middle Eastern studies that published an article on bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. In fact, it was an article that dismissed the importance. It was by our good friend and colleague Magnus Ransdorf, but it was an enormously important article because it delved into bin Laden's fatwas. But then Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, I remember this very clearly. At the end of August 2001, I met Peter Bergen for the first time, and he was expressing his frustration that an article he had written about the trials of bin Laden's accomplices in the United States and the 1998 bombings of the U.S. embassies in East Africa. No one would publish it. Every, foreign affairs, foreign policy, national interest. I mean, everyone rejected it. And he asked me if I was interested in publishing it. He said, he had an incredibly compelling story. He said he cashed in all his 401k retirement accounts. He wasn't working at CNN at the time to write this book on bin Laden that became Holy War Inc. This is literally, it was maybe 12 or 13 days before 9/11. So I said, send me the article. I accepted it the next day. Well, I shouldn't say that. I sent it out for review the next day. It was accepted before September 11th, and it was that issue of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism was published at the end of September. So, I mean, that was an example where Peter Bergen, he wasn't an established scholar either. He was a journalist, but it was a very scholarly article. Otherwise, it wouldn't have passed the peer review. But it was a very important article, but everyone had passed on it. So it's to be more daring. I mean, I found, and I assume you find this with Terrorism and Political Violence, which was, of course, the flagship, is the flagship journal in the field and the oldest one. There's a clumping together that terrorism scholars often go with what they think is most in vogue to appeal to editors. So there's been this huge proliferation, I remember, in the 2000s on articles on suicide terrorism. There's now been a huge proliferation, or recent years, on social media articles, for example, and especially ISIS. It would be to be more intellectually daring, I would say. That's what's going to get people's attention. The key is, too, in our field, is the comparative basis is so important. That it's not enough just to drill down deeply, let's say, into Boko Haram or JNIM. I mean, that's important and it's interesting. But what I think readers are always interested in, what are the broader lessons, both in what they're doing and how it might spread, or how they're learning from other terrorist groups. Pivotal is critically important, and how that affects our countermeasures. So, I mean, a lot of articles that I see, I mean, they're too much in the weeds in some respect. And I think, and they need to have that expertise, but they need to draw out what the lessons of it are. And that was something that I think, in the aftermath of 9/11, I mean, people went down very narrow stovepipes or rabbit holes. So I would argue that broadly comparative, to me, are the most interesting things, rooted in a very deep expertise. But, we're all products of our own kind of, subjective, our own academic training, our own, subjective views on things, because we're human beings. I mean, this goes back to when I was hired at RAND, the hiring memo. What Brian had said made me a good hire is that I was a utility player, which would not seem like a compliment, referring to baseball, that you can play a number of different positions. It's that I had this curiosity and interest, not just in one particular terrorist group or movement or one particular region, but we're, drawing broad lessons from diverse cases. So, that I think has been enormously beneficial in my career. And I worry that sometimes people are too narrowly focused. And sometimes their articles, I mean, they'll still be published. But if you're asking what really attracts an editor's attention, I think is this ability to broaden one's aperture and say something meaningfully about patterns, let's say, as opposed to specificity.
And of course, that kind of is opposite to some degree what we push our students to do in their doctoral dissertations. Focus very narrowly on a very specific topic and get really into the weeds of it and find something new about it. So they have to be historically informed, keep a broad perspective while you're developing expertise about one particularly narrow area for your dissertation. That's a tough, bridge to sort of, keep on, but.
Well, I had the narrow. I mean, I was the same kind of product, and I think that's right. And of course, a dissertation is different from articles and books. I mean, the Columbia Book Series, I think, does have this very wide aperture. But that's why book-labeled publications, especially by university presses, are both so important, make such a large contribution, and also, let's be honest too, for promotion at universities. A solid university press publication is the surest road to tenure and promotion to full professor. I mean, there's many other excellent venues, but the truth of the matter is at universities, well, in university promotions for academicians, university presses are the coin of the realm. But that's why I would encourage people. It's not to say you shouldn't publish your theses. And there's many excellent theses that I've published in the Columbia series. The point is, as you embark on your career, it's, I think, to broaden, because terrorism is a global phenomenon. And therefore, I mean, some of Tricia Bacon's work, I think, is an excellent example of how she has brought, I mean, her latest book, The Counterinsurgency Dilemma, that compares Somalia to Afghanistan. I mean, this is such an important book because it kind of challenges the conventional wisdom about foreign fighters. But there's exactly a case in point. I mean, Tricia started her career at the State Department, verily, as people in government are, they have their own account, which was East Africa. But it's fascinating. I was on her PhD committee, and she wrote about terrorist alliances. She took that core fundamental expertise she had in one particular area, and even a group, Al-Shabaab, and broadened that out to a really impressive doctoral thesis that, of course, was published. And then now has continued that. And she's, I think, is a role model now for students. So yeah, of course, in your PhD is unique. As I always tell my students, it's the hardest thing you'll ever do in your life. I think it's much easier to write books than to write a PhD, because you're doing it for an audience, basically your committee. And you are, as you described, James, focused on something very narrow. You have to, become an expert in that often very recondite field. But in your career, I would say Tricia is a great example, is how you broaden that depth of knowledge to a broader understanding and in turn expertise.
That's excellent. One of the things we always talk about is, how terrorism and counterterrorism are rooted in context. It's sort of a contextual phenomenon. So, I guess, part of the advice would be, don't lose sight of the context as you're focusing in on that very specific topic. Is there anything else you'd like to mention that we haven't already discussed?
No, it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm glad that you've prompted all these thoughts that no one else really asks. So
Well,
I'm very grateful.
we're very grateful as well for you sharing all this wisdom and knowledge with us and your experiences. And of course, thank you for all your contributions over the last 50 years to the study of terrorism and counterterrorism that we've all learned so much for. And I wish you all the best for continued success.
Well, you're very kind. Thanks so much, James.